Hello there and a very good evening. Welcome to another episode of the People's Platform for the News First team. I am Jayamal Ratnayaka. Today is the 21st of April 2023. And on a day like today, 4 years ago, more than 300 Sri Lankans were taken away from their loved ones. And to this date, since 4 years, justice still eludes them. So on the 4th year remembrance of the 21st April Easter Sunday massacre, let us hope that those who have gone from us are at peace, and those who perpetrated this vile incident will be brought to justice, and those who have been taken away from us and the loved ones of the victims are given due justice that they seek for 4 long years. As always, People's Platform will seek to address the pertinent topics that are emerging in the country and as well as the world, and as well today we are here to talk about an emerging topic that could have global repercussions, and the topic for tonight is the dawn of a new world order. Why do I say that? I say that because recently there was a very interesting development between the BRICS organization. The BRICS is an organization that is made up of 5 emerging economies, including Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. To talk about this in depth, we have invited to our studios tonight Kusum Vijay Tilaka. He is a political commentator and also well versed in this topic. Thank you, Kusum, for accepting our invitation and joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Jaimal. Always a pleasure to be here.
Right, Kusum. So let's get straight into it, shall we? Kusum, I want to talk to you first about the BRICS and how their influence has come to be so large over the past few months and in the past few years as well. So to give our viewers a bit of an insight, the BRICS organization, like I said, are formed by 5 emerging economies or countries that are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They make up 41% of the global population and also contribute 24% to global GDP. And my first question to you tonight, Kusum, is, like I said at the start of the show, is there a dawn of a new world order? Are we seeing the political power play shifting? And is Western hegemony finally coming to an end?
Well, Jaimal, I think you raised the question in the right way, because the BRICS is very much sort of a response to the world order that you mentioned. Okay, so let's take a look at what this world order entails. There's obviously a lot of conversation around the Western hegemony. So let's take BRICS, for instance, and the BRICS Bank, the financial system, the IMF, for instance. These are all, even though there is significant Chinese interest in these multilateral organizations, there's a Western tilt to these institutions.
Right.
Okay, some suggest that these are instruments of Western political governments,
Right.
that these are used to sort of supplement foreign policy in other ways. But at the end of the day, in the modern context, the IMF, for example, has now for many decades been a lender of last resort, right? So Sri Lanka is a prime example.
Yes.
When all else has failed, when we've lost our credit ratings, we approached the IMF. For funding. Now, the IMF plays an important role within the international financial structure, right? Because as we've been told in Sri Lanka, it's not the quantum of the loan that Sri Lanka has applied for, it's the seal of approval that we get from the IMF. So
Yes.
the IMF has now built up a reputation whereby if there's a country within an IMF program, lenders around the world, whether they're bilateral lenders or they're other multilaterals like the World Bank, etc., they have a certain amount of confidence in that country.
Right.
Now, to just take you to BRICS, as you said, BRICS consists of 4 very large economies, and South Africa, which is also a very large economy on the African continent. The concept around BRICS was initially developed by, I think it was the president of Goldman Sachs and some of his analysts. Okay,
Right.
so the idea in, I suppose, the late 2000s, so maybe around about the dawn of the financial crisis, I think analysts around the world started recognizing, well, they had recognized emerging markets further east. Okay, BRICS is sort of an amalgamation of some of the largest economies in the world, and as you said, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they account for a significant portion of global GDP. Also significant is the amount of trade that it accounts for. Now, BRICS is sort of conceptually meant to not only be an alternative to the Western model in the IMF, etc. It's also meant to supplement. So it's not that you have to choose one or the other. It's not that aggressive. The other side of the coin is that it's been the BRICS as an organization, as I said, the concept started in the late 2000s, and it's been growing steadily. Has it reached its potential? No, not even close. The other thing to point out is while these economies were on a certain growth trajectory in 2008, 2009, some of that growth trajectory has shifted. It's sort of come down, it's gone up again. So I don't think anyone can say that the BRICS is where everyone thought it would be by this time, 10, 15 years down the line. But at the same time, we see, especially in the last few days, there's been a BRICS meeting. I think the Brazilian President Lula da Silva visited the BRICS headquarters in Shanghai. They've been talking about a currency, which I'm sure we'll discuss as well. So this is all sort of a reaction to what you mentioned in your original question about this global order. Now, there are several pressures on the global order, okay? The global order that we describe as the current order started after World War II. World War II saw a resounding victory for the Allied forces. It also meant the complete destruction of much of Europe, including Allied nations. And the United States, many people would agree, that and the 5 to 10 years after World War II, from 1945 onwards, is probably the peak of American power globally. Okay, that was when the economy was growing at its fastest. It was globally in a lot of different ponds, so fishing in different ponds, so to say. Okay, it became foundational to the global economy in a way that it had not prior to this. Since then, we've seen the emergence of other economies in Asia, starting from the Japan, China, etc., Russia, all that. And we've seen since World War II the Cold War, where we were looking at sort of a multipolar or a bipolar world with a very powerful nation in Russia and an even more powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States. So we've sort of been shifting away from the focus of all power and all financial power from the United States. It's been shifting away because of the growth of China. Now, for the last, I would say, 20 years, and this may have been ending around the 2010, 2015s, there's been a sort of a situation where for 2 decades, let's say from the 1980s, 1990s onwards, the growth of China and the United States has become synergistic in the sense that they're growing together. And they're growing together by design, because the United States said, okay, we have no space to grow internally, but you can produce goods cheaper, and then we can buy your goods, and it will be cheaper for everybody else. And it's created...
So they complement one another.
They complement one another, and the byproduct of that is that the Chinese economy has seen perhaps the largest movement of people from below the poverty line and just above the poverty line to the middle class. It's the greatest migration in history, hundreds of millions of people. So it's a very successful story, right? And now there are pressures on the Chinese side as well, because there's a demographic imbalance. We've seen some major protests in China regarding the financial sector, COVID, the zero COVID policy. So there are now pressures on this international system on both sides. The United States has gone through a period of war, economic pressures, political instability. So the United States, many commentators believe, has sort of relinquished some aspect of its role as a global leader. Okay. Now, it's true. You can look at that from different ways. A lot of people, for example, from the political left, suggest that this is a good thing. Many people suggest that America being a leader in the global space is a positive. So it really depends on your perspective of this. But the BRICS, to come back to your question, is about countering or providing an alternative as well as supplementing these financial structures. And because it includes Russia and China and India, which have various which have various relationships with the West, it's seen as somewhat of a competitor from the global South, which is sort of competing with the current international order.
Right.
So, to answer your question about whether it signals an end to this global order, I think there's been a dilution of the global order, a shifting of the global order.
Right.
For me personally, and many analysts will agree, that the BRICS has yet to show its real teeth, even through its bank. It's called the New Development Bank. It is in certain markets, it is making strides, but of course it's not anywhere near where a lot of other analysts expect. Certainly Goldman Sachs would have expected much more from BRICS in this last 15 years.
I see. So, Kusum, talk to me about the de-dollarization topic. That has been a topic that's swirling in the media sphere for a couple of weeks now, ever since Iran and Saudi Arabia were brought together by China after 7 years. I think it was the first time in 7 years that diplomats from Iran and Saudi Arabia had formal talks with one another in China, which is a huge step for China. And now we are hearing about the de-dollarization topic, which has maybe come as a surprise to the US?
Yeah, so two things. Just to touch on the Chinese negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a big deal. Obviously, you're well aware of the Sunni-Shia conflicts over many over thousands of years, perhaps, and these are the two central antagonists in the Middle Eastern region, correct? Having said that, I think the Chinese overtures towards peace, I view it as a little bit superficial, but certainly just the optics of it. Having a Chinese leader, I think he was a foreign minister, having MBS and a representative from Iran. It's a big deal, at least in terms of optics, and it's showing that, there's a different leader in the world that's willing to. So from an optics point of view, it's important. The de-dollarization conversation is deep. So let's start with basically where it comes from. It's called the petrodollar hypothesis. So the petrodollar hypothesis suggests that the value of the US dollar and its position as the reserve currency in the world is partly or significantly derived from the global demand for US dollars for the trade of energy and other goods. So global trade is virtually everywhere, 80% carried out in dollars. Okay, so there was a Bretton Woods. Previously, the global currencies were pegged to gold. They took away that system.
President Nixon, I think, changed.
Nixon. Now we are in an era where the subject of the Western global hegemony brings out the subject of currency and the US dollar's preeminence as the global reserve currency. Now, I would suggest that, yes, there's certainly going to be an effect, because if Saudi Arabia, which is one of the largest energy traders in the world, switches from the dollar, if Russia has already switched from the dollar, let's say a lot of other countries do it as well, that's certainly going to have an impact on the demand for the dollar. But for me, we have to first see, okay, if our country is going to shift from the dollar, what are they shifting to? Okay, so let's take the yuan and the renminbi. The yuan and the renminbi is great if you're doing trade with China. Okay, and a lot of countries do have trade with China. But at the end of the day, what makes the dollar different to the renminbi? It's that the financial system that underpins the US dollar is a lot more open. There's a lot more data. There's a lot of reporting. Now, you can point to American financial reporting and say there's some things that are suspect, but the fact of the matter is it's by multitude of 10 or 100 times, it's way more open than the Chinese system. You have a lot more access to information about the American economy. And that builds an intrinsic value around the US dollar, because you kind of understand, you have a better understanding of what is underpinning this, what are the economic strengths that are underpinning the US dollar. And while we're talking about de-dollarization, we're talking about it today in 2023 at a moment when the Chinese economy is not at its best state, right? It's already had to, I think, scale back its growth projections. There's a demographic challenge, as I mentioned. There was a very recent property collapse with Evergrande, a major Chinese property developer collapsing. And there's also been various other things, for example, the issues surrounding the founder of Alibaba, There's a
Jack Ma.
conspiracy around Jack Ma. So there are certain issues with openness in the Chinese system. And at this stage, I think de-dollarization is a little further down the road, if at all. And even if we shift from doing trade in dollars, the size of the American economy suggests that it may be a while yet before the dollar loses its preeminence as perhaps the most valuable currency in the world.
Right. So I want to talk to you about US-Saudi relations as well. We know in 1945, when the petrodollar was created, how President Roosevelt struck a deal with the leaders of Saudi Arabia. However, now with China's diplomacy coming forward and emerging economies trying to ditch the dollar for, especially in terms of energy, do you feel like Saudi Arabia's relations with the US was mismanaged over the years?
I can't use the word mismanaged. Certainly the Saudi relationship with the United States has had a lot of advantages for both Saudi Arabia and the United States. In fact, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is very much a client state of the United States, or has been a client state of the United States for more than 30 years. Okay. Now, we've seen a realignment. I think we can use the word realignment quite a lot when you're talking about the modern international relations context.
Yes.
Saudi Arabia, even with Iran, even with these very superficial overtures, even in its, they've sort of cooled their tensions with Qatar to a certain degree. Okay.
Yes.
They've talked about when the oil price was quite low, there was all this conversation about Saudi Arabia diversifying away. You saw women being allowed to drive. There was a real culture. They're trying to make a cultural shift there, sort of at least to promote a different view, a different idea of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so this is all happening in a situation where, because Saudi Arabia exists in a very interesting sort of triangle around US foreign policy. Okay, you have to take the Iranian issue and the Iranian issue with the United States. Then you have to take Israel and the Israeli issue with the United States and the Israeli partnership with the United States. And then Saudi Arabia is sort of a buffer there as well.
Right.
Now, if you remember the Trump administration, a very famous moment during the Trump administration was when he invited Mohammed bin Salman to the White House, to the Oval Office. And during the meeting, he sort of got one of his aides to give him a massive chart where he showed all the weapons deals that the United States has done with Saudi Arabia. And he said, "Oh, thank you very much for all these deals. I want to share." So he was sort of propagating this view that Saudi Arabia is a very valuable ally for the United States economically. Now Saudi Arabia has decided that they have other interests and the United States is not the only game in town. How the United States reacts to this is what's really interesting, and that's what remains to be seen.
Right. So we are in conversation with Kusum Vijay Tilaka, political commentator, especially in terms of how the world order is shifting and the influence of emerging markets and economies such as China, India, and so on will affect the global power plays and dynamics. We will cross over for a short commercial break. Stay tuned to the People's Platform. We will be right back. Welcome back to the People's Platform. We are in conversation with Kusum Vijay Tilaka, political commentator, on geopolitics, the dynamics of emerging markets and how they are influencing or attacking Western hegemony at present and posing a real threat. Kusum, before we went into the break, you spoke about a synergy between the US and China. Despite China being one of the greatest competitors of the US, it is also the US's biggest trading partner, to the tune of more than $700 billion in trade each year. So if there is a shift waiting to happen in terms of supply chains, in terms of goods and services being exchanged, I personally don't think it would happen maybe over in the next decade or so, is it? Because can two nations who depend on each other very much just cut off ties in an instant?
Yes, so the domestic American political scenario has, I think, illuminated this issue very well. Starting even before the Obama candidature, but Obama was one of the first presidents who sort of came out and said that the United States has a huge problem with outsourcing its manufacturing. The American dream, I think.
Yes,
you've
that,
read
as it's
about
called.
it, right? That's what it's called. It's basically based around the foundation of the American dream is that you work a job, and you earn enough money to live a solid middle class life, to ensure your children have an education, etc. That's the American dream. Okay, a lot of that is based on American manufacturing. Okay, there's entire cities across the United States, from Detroit, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. These are industrial towns.
Yes.
Okay, they've been built up just from manufacturing. Now, since I think it was in the 80s when the United States allowed China to enter the World Trade Organization. It's called the normalization of trade relations with China. So ever since then, China has been able to access this global trade market. Now, that's sort of led to what's commonly called the neoliberal era, right? It's where American manufacturing shifted. You may remember the 90s conversations around sweatshops, Nike making shoes in China, and exploiting labor. So this is part of the American growth story, and it's part of the Chinese growth story. So there's no getting away from that. But what happened is throughout the 90s and the 2000s, by the time it came to Obama's candidacy, much of these cities that I mentioned, the auto industry and manufacturing,
from the GMs to the Ford,
to the Ford, everything was collapsing. All the manufacturing was moving to China and to the east, and all those manufacturing jobs were gone. And a lot of the manufacturing jobs that remained were mechanized. There's a lot of robotics involved. So technology has also displaced workers in the United States. Now, this became a huge political issue, because what you saw is previously solid democratic voting cities started shifting to the right, because they noticed that no one was paying attention to the fact that all these jobs were shifting to the east. Far from it, the American media and the political landscape was saying that this was a positive thing because it's lowering prices. So since the Obama era, and it really accelerated under Trump, that's why the China trade war began, the United States has been sort of very clear that they can't continue to offshore its manufacturing, right? So the United States has its own problem, because if it onshores manufacturing, it increases costs. So in that case, stagnant wages are going to have to start increasing. So that's a whole other conversation. But in terms of this synergy, I think there was a writer called Professor Niall Ferguson, Scottish-American researcher, professor. He suggested something called the Chimerican divorce. So China and America, Chimerica, and he calls it the Chimerican divorce. And he shows how over time the United States has been decoupling from China, because they noticed that China's basically used the United States market to grow its own market. Now, this shouldn't have come as a surprise, but from a political standpoint, if you think about the political parties in the United States, both of them have been on the side of normalizing relations. So now they've come to a stage where they have to sort of go back and tell the people, this was a mistake, or at least something that we should have controlled better. So in that situation, China, on the other hand, right? China's been growing at 5, 6, 7, 8% for a very long time, as we said. But more recently, we've seen China having to say we were going to grow at 6%, no, now we're going to grow at 2%, 3%. And then COVID-19 came about, and the Chinese COVID zero policy has created a very significant problem for the CCP, for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. Amidst all this, China's own issues in the South China Sea, the threats to Taiwan. So all of this sort of brings in this supply chain narrative. Okay, so if we just list the top 15 countries by the size of their economies, you might think these are 10, 15 most important countries in terms of the world economy. But in fact, that's not quite how it works. It's what your industries are. So a country like Taiwan, for instance, is not a very big country in terms of global GDP, but it controls perhaps the most crucial thing in the modern economy, and that is the manufacture of semiconductors. Right? So all Taiwanese companies operating in China, of all places. You can look at Russia. Russia is roughly the size of Mexico, a little bit bigger than Mexico and Spain. But the Russian economy becomes a superpower when you consider it through the lens of the global supply chain of energy, natural gas and petroleum. So the American global growth story is now a little bit of a confusing story. So they're not quite sure where the next growth spurt comes from. Obama, in fact, tried to normalize relations with Russia and Putin. He said they wanted to do what was called the Asian pivot, the pivot to Asia, where he wanted to further normalize relations with China, get into more trade deals.
Right.
Trump comes along and does a 180. He says, no, we're going to get out of trade deals.
Going to make America great again.
We're going to shift this emphasis on China, away from manufacturing in China, and
bring it back to
America. To the United States.
Right.
And Joe Biden has in fact continued much of the Trump foreign policy.
I see.
He's doubled down on some of these. He's not reneged from the trade war. He's in fact taking it a step further. And even in the manufacture of semiconductors, the United States is now threatening the industrialization of the European Union. It's threatening the semiconductors industry worldwide in Taiwan and China. Of course, with some help from Taiwan. Taiwan itself understands that having your largest production facility in a country that considers you part of their own country, China, is not a very good idea. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company TSMC has started building a high-tech manufacturing plant in Arizona in the United States.
Nice. Okay.
So this is the shift that we are seeing. Okay, how far it goes along, it really depends, because a lot of things are in flux. The Russian situation is in flux, the Chinese situation is in flux, and the United States is in flux because they are also sort of reimagining their supply chains. India, a very powerful nation, right in the middle of the global trading nexus. India is part of BRICS. Okay, China is also part of BRICS.
Yes.
India last year around this time had a actual war with China on their border, a little war, let's say a small war, where there was exchange of no artillery exchange, but there was fighting with poles, knives, swords. I think there was about 150 deaths, depending on which source. So in that kind of climate, India also finds itself as part of the overall security structure of this part of the region with the United States. So India finds itself in a very precarious situation where they have to get along with China, they have to get along with Russia, they have to get along with the United States, but at the same time the United States has huge tensions with China and Russia. So this global game, I have a feeling, is only just getting started. So it's really difficult to tell where it's going to go.
Let's localize this story a bit. Countries like Sri Lanka, who are very less influential compared to the major players in the global markets and global economy. What sort of path should we take? What sort of stance should we adopt? Because we know Sri Lanka relies heavily on China, on India, and even the US when it comes to the IMF, because the US is the IMF's biggest contributor, if I'm not mistaken. So against such a backdrop, how does Sri Lanka position itself? And we know that our location is of strategic importance to many countries, from India to China to the US, in terms of security, in terms of surveillance. So given all of that, how does Sri Lanka position itself and align its foreign policy to make sure that it can weather any sort of development that comes from maybe the West, the East, and anywhere in the world?
Yeah, I think Sri Lanka's, to discuss Sri Lanka's alignments, you have to consider where we are right now. Now, Sri Lanka has this long-term non-alignment policy.
Yes.
How much faith you put in, or how much weight you put behind our non-alignment status is up for debate for me. The last 10, 15 years has seen a very clear shift towards the Chinese orbit. There's no question about that. The United States, far from just being the IMF's main contributor, is our largest export market. So they have a lot of leverage over Sri Lanka as well. At the same time, we have India, which is one of our
big
closest allies, but also we have to manage it because of the northern political issue. And I think since in the post-war era, the Indians may have missed a trick with Sri Lanka. They've sort of allowed, and I think the Rajapaksa government had a lot to do with it, where it was a very obvious sort of ploy to utilize Chinese investments and Chinese footprints in Sri Lanka as a bulwark against the Indian pressure to implement the 13th Amendment. And so there's a real sort of mix of domestic politics and international foreign relations at play here.
But now it doesn't seem as if, I personally feel, it doesn't seem as if India is willing to take that anymore, right? Because
the problem that India has is that India has to work with China to some extent, but it also has to repel China.
Yeah, it has to maintain its own integrity.
Exactly. Now, India, in that sense, I think the Foreign Minister Jai Shankar has been talking about this. He's been treading a very fine line because there's a lot of pressure on India as an American ally to sort of take a stance against Russia, whereas Russia is one of India's main defense partners and has been for many decades. So Sri Lanka has to sort of understand, first of all, where we are and what we've been doing all this time. The data is clear on that. But we have to look for other friends, right? Because we have to diversify our partners. And I think if we can just, this language of non-alignment sometimes is unhelpful, because you can say a non-alignment all you like, but if the data shows that, well, you're becoming more and more aligned to one side of the hemisphere, to one hemisphere over the other. So I've always talked about Japan as being a great partner for Sri Lanka. We have historical relationships with Japan. We had the Japanese, in fact, are one of the largest investors in infrastructure in South Asia. In fact, within the ASEAN community, which is a group of a trading bloc of the ASEAN, the Japanese have invested more within the ASEAN community than even China.
Right. But even Sri Lanka-Japan relations were soured in recent past.
Yes, and that's and why is that, right? Because we can only think of one reason why you would cancel a very good Japanese light rail project. So this is the problem. I mean, are we going to allow a very large Chinese footprint to sort of decide our foreign policy? Are we going to try to become more independent of the Chinese footprint? Do we have any real chance of diversifying our export markets? Even tourism. Let's take tourism, for instance. There's a very interesting conversation right now about the shifting tourism market in Sri Lanka, right? We used to be Western Europeans, Germans, French, the British. Now we've shifted. Okay, there's less
Indians,
than to Indians,
Russians.
Chinese, Russians, Ukrainians, etc. So just take a look at the GDP per capita of those countries compared to the Western European countries. It's not even close. It's about half in some occasions. So we are clearly then getting a less value spend tourist, in which case we have to increase volumes in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Is Sri Lanka's future as a volume tourist destination? It's difficult to say. I've been in the tourist industry myself, so I have a little bit of understanding in this. It doesn't seem that the spending by Chinese tourists will make up for the spending that we're missing out from Western
Europeans.
So, and tourism is part of our strategy to come out of in the short term.
Exactly.
To get additional
Which means
foreign
we
currency.
need as much money as we can get.
And we may need to start improving our relations with Western countries. And there are barriers such as the price of airline tickets. The price of airline tickets has gone up by 200% from the European continent to Colombo. We no longer have multiple flights through Sri Lankan Airlines.
Exactly.
You know, so and all this talk of the Sri Lankan Airlines, a national carrier. There was a reason we had a national carrier, right? It was to help our tourism industry. So we've completely messed up the national carrier. That's beyond question. But that doesn't mean the concept of having a national carrier was flawed to begin with, because that's not a bad idea, because not many countries are going to just fly planes to Colombo. You have to do it yourself sometimes. So this is part of the complication that Sri Lanka is faced with at the moment.
Right. So you spoke about Russia. I want to talk to you about the Ukraine-Russia war and how the US plays a part in it. We saw, and we were discussing this before the program, how certain US intelligence reports were leaked, of all things, on a Discord server. Yeah. Can you just surprise me a bit on that?
As I said, I'm not very conversant with the Discord server, but it's basically a chat device, right, for people who play video games.
Right.
So it seems that a very junior member of US intelligence, he's been named, his name was Teixeira, American citizen. He was on this Discord network, and for several months he's been releasing classified data on that chat room, thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And it really sort of came to pass because he had left a comment on his Discord server to his other friends saying that, I'm not going to keep posting, something like, I'm not going to keep posting classified intelligence data if you guys aren't going to take it seriously. So the story is that he's basically trying to impress his friends online, and he's gone and sort of
dumped all of the intelligence reports.
And the intelligence reports were stunning. I mean, this was the first time that we knew that the Western forces have boots on the ground in Ukraine. It's never been reported before.
Yes.
It's not massive numbers. I think the highest number is 50 Special Forces soldiers from the United Kingdom, and 14 from France and 14 from the US.
Right.
Small numbers, but it still means something that there are boots on the ground, because that's not something that's ever been accepted. We got information that the Ukrainian military is losing ammunition, that their air defenses are struggling. We've also got information that the Russian forces are completely sort of understaffed. They have problems with manpower. They have problems with supply lines, because the geography and topography of the European continent is such that there's very few access points to some of these regions. So if you take Crimea, for instance, which is very central to the Ukraine conflict, Crimea is now taken over by Russia,
right,
and they can protect that it's like a little peninsula with a small link between the main continent. It's almost an island, but it's not.
Okay,
but
so it's limited access.
It's limited access, so that's a choke point. Now, Russia has taken over the peninsula, but its supply lines are struggling because they have to supply, because there's
ammunition.
They have supply ammunition, medical supplies, etc. And the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, said very early on in the conflict that this conflict has started with Crimea and it will end with Crimea. So there's a conversation about Ukraine trying to take back Crimea. To most analysts, this seems like a very ambitious thing to do. But the fact of the matter is, what these intelligence leaks has also shown is that the Russian military before this invasion was considered the second most powerful military in the entire world, second only to the United States. Okay, now, everyone expected when the invasion began that the Ukrainian defense
would be a simple task for the Russians. Yeah.
But it's sort of shown that what Russia is, it's been called a paper tiger. It's been shown to be not as efficient a military as it should have been, as people thought it was. So this has really shifted sort of the balance of how people view it. And China is another interesting point. It's an ally of Russia. They too probably thought that Russia would have Ukraine under control by now. Yeah. And they're seeing that this is just going on and on.
So do you believe Russian soldiers were not battle-hardened enough to face the conflict?
I think one of the other reports is that there have been more Russian deaths than Ukrainian deaths. So that was some of the casualty things had been released on this intelligence leak. But I think the fact of the matter is that the Russian military has just depleted. It hasn't been modernized, and it has major supply chain issues. So it's just not efficient, because fighting a ground war on large continental spaces requires a lot of experience, and Russia built up a huge amount of experience over 4 or 5 decades of constant conflict. Much of that experience has withered away in the last 20-30 years, and they haven't been able, because of their economy, they haven't been able to update their military. So this is something that I think has taken a lot of analysts by surprise. And also on the other side, it's the American and the European support to Ukraine that is keeping this conflict going. And I think the very logical critique of this war is that if the US and the West wanted peace, they could get it, because they could force Ukraine onto the negotiating table. But even, they're not. There were leaks. There were more leaks, not this particular leak, but in December there was a leak that showed that Ukraine and Russia were ready to announce a broad peace deal in April last year. But there was a surprise visit by then UK Prime Minister Johnson,
Boris Johnson.
He went a surprise visit to Ukraine and told the Ukrainians not to accept any peace deal, and saying that we can, because they see this as an opportunity to weaken Putin and the Russian flank. So I think the West has to push for some kind of peace negotiation. I think it might be coming sooner than people might expect.
Right, certainly very interesting developments in the global aspect, and Sri Lanka also, being located in a very strategically important location, must navigate its way through all of these obstacles. We were engaged in a very interesting conversation with Kusum Vijaytilaka, political commentator. Thank you very much, Kusum, for joining us this evening. Although we unfortunately don't have enough time, I would like to delve deeper into this topic and much more. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the People's Platform this evening. Thank you and have a great night.